Hello. I decided to do my first video presentation on Edwin G. Boring. I actually didn't find any of the information in our textbook about him boring at all. I thought it was very fascinating, and I wanted to see what further information I could find out about him. So I did a Google research, and I was able to find an article on the Harvard webpage. Of course, you know, he was a part of the faculty at one point there. I also found YouTube videos. There were several different YouTube videos, with information about him as well. And then there's also a part of the Encyclopedia Britannica that I found that actually had some really knowledgeable stuff about him and actually went into more detail about the experiment side. But I'd like to just take some time and read what I did find in the Harvard article about him, because you know he did work at the university at one point, and it said that he had joined the faculty as an associate professor in 1922, and by 1928 he was a full professor. In 1956 he retired as the Edgar Pierce Professor of Psychology Emeritus. I'm sorry if I'm not saying, I know I'm not saying that right. He also served as director of the Psychological Laboratory from 1924 to 1949. Boring's strongly positive view of psychology as a science made a large imprint on Harvard's psychology department. Over the course of his long career, Boring never wavered from his emphasis on experimental psychology as the only legitimate scientific way of probing the relationship between the environment and the human behavior. Boring's efforts to shape the way psychology was practiced at Harvard bore fruit in 1937, when the psychology department gained complete independence from the philosophy department, to which it had been tethered since its founding more than 50 years earlier. And that's definitely something that I learned. Like, I didn't really realize until taking the history of psychology that it was actually, you know, based from philosophy. Like they used to be intertwined, and until Boring and you know, several others had, you know, fought and everything for it to become its own separate department, which, you know, it did. And it says, as an experimental researcher, Boring conducted innovative studies of visual perception. He introduced to the literature his now classic example of a perceptually ambiguous figure, which depicts both a young woman and an old woman, also known as the Boring figure. He also published influential work on the moon illusion, the fact that the moon looks larger on the horizon than at its zenith. And he was also known as Mr. Psychology. He wrote prolifically, including his classic book, History of Experimental Psychology, which remains an invaluable reference to this day, and was active in the major psychological associations. His theoretical papers inspired research by other experimental psychologists, including his student S.S. Stevens. Edwin Boring is listed as number 3 on the American Psychological Association list of the 100 most eminent psychologist of the 20th century. So, yeah, I think his work and what he did for psychology is very important, and is definitely something that we should learn. You know, history is a very important subject, and, you know, it does help in the present day, and so that's why I thought Edwin Boring was not boring at all. He's really fascinating.